The three big takeaways since last night. Donald Trump has fired the first shots in what will likely be a massive global trade war. He has imposed hefty tariffs on imports across the board. The EU and China have vowed to hit back in equal measure. Good news for India: exemptions on exports of pharmaceuticals, energy products and even bullion. Export Association says these tariffs give Indian exporters new opportunities. Meanwhile, the government of India says it is studying the implications of what Trump has announced and is engaged with stakeholders in the United States in pursuit of a bilateral treaty. The government also says that this development may lead to new opportunities on account of evolving US trade policy. And hello and welcome. You are watching Easynomics, and joining us to decode the economic impact of Trump's tariffs, Rajani Sinha, Chief Economist at CARE Ratings, Dheeraj Nair, Chief Economist at Vedanta, and Dr. Jan Dasgupta, former ambassador to the World Trade Organization. But before we go across to our guests, let's take a quick listen into what Chief Economic Advisor Anantha Nageshwaran had to say just a little while back.
We all knew that in some form or the other, the status quo in the world had built up a lot of imbalances. I mean, domestic demand imbalance between countries. Some countries export and save too much and spend too little domestically, and some overdo it. And we also had another form of imbalance in terms of the discourse between net zero and economic growth. And we had an imbalance between too much of finance and too little real economy. So in many ways, there were so many imbalances and they were coming to a head. So in some sense, you need these kinds of disruptions for us to rethink the entire playbook, and that is what is happening. I think on balance, India is playing its cards well, and we have our options, and we are strategically focusing on the relationship in the broader sense. I think we should come out well because we have dealt with so many other shocks in the last 17, 18 years, starting with the global financial crisis.
And very well, actually.
And each one of them has left our economy in a better spot eventually than before those crises. And I'm sure this will be no exception.
That was Chief Economic Advisor Anantha Nageshwaran making a point about rethinking the playbook. And I want to come to you first, Dr. Dasgupta. Straight up on that point, is this a moment where India needs to rethink its playbook? We already seem to have indications from the government, at least in terms of the multiple trade-related engagements that we have seen pick up pace in the last few months. What really is the India impact and the way forward after this announcement? Dr. Dasgupta.
I think this is a kind of a wake-up call. The tariffs, of course, are extremely disturbing, not only for India, but for a multitude of countries. And the impact will be felt very strongly by the consumers of the US and, of course, the consumers in other countries as well. So, in short, I think there are two very important aspects that this wake-up call has alerted us to. First is there any way we can bring down the US tariffs on Indian products? And if not, what is going to be the impact on Indian products? The second issue is that we need to set our own house in order, and our transaction costs are high, our infrastructure, barring a few areas, is not up to speed. So a whole lot of things need to be done, and irrespective of what happens to the Trump tariffs, whether they get rolled back after 6 months or 1 year or after 4 years, irrespective of that, I think we must focus our full attention to setting our own house in order and becoming more competitive.
That's a fair point. I'll come back to you on that. But Rajani, very quickly before I go to Dheeraj, the point that I want to pick up with you, what is the likely impact on growth at this stage that you can forecast for India and for the globe? And in an interconnected world, supply chain driven world, it's clear India will not be able to escape the consequences of what happens elsewhere.
tried to work out the direct impact of the reciprocal tariff. So if we just look at the direct impact in terms of increase in prices for our export, it turns out to be around, I would say, roughly around $9 billion, which would be around 0.2 to 0.3% of GDP. That's the kind of direct impact that we are talking about. Here we have assumed two things. One, there will be some weakening of rupee that will kind of in some partially blunt the impact of tariff. And we have also assumed that some of our competitors, like China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, are going to be hit even harder by the tariff increase, because for them the increase in tariff is even higher and they will get impacted more. So we may have little bit of opportunity there. So factoring these two aspects, I'm talking about direct impact of 0.2 to 0.3% of GDP. But more important aspect is what would be the indirect impact of this whole thing, which is difficult to quantify. But I'll just highlight the aspect that now there are concerns around whole global growth slowing. So it will impact our overall exports, not just our exports to US. So that's something that we need to be wary of. Second, even if we look at the sentiments domestically, investment, if we look at private investment, it was still slow to pick up. Though we were saying that the whole ground is set up for private investment to pick up, but it hadn't picked up really in the last few years, not in a meaningful way. And now with this uncertainty increasing so significantly, there'll be even more concerns on investment front, and investors may just decide to
Okay.
wait and watch. So if you take into account these aspects, and on top of that, the impact on capital flows to the economy, the
Okay.
indirect impact could be more severe.
Dheeraj, I had another former Commerce Secretary on the show earlier today who made this point: Make in India will not become Make in the United States. Take it from there, really, in terms of what do you expect to happen with regard to India's recalibration of the previous 10 odd years of trade policy. We've had an import substitution policy under the overall rubric of Make in India. It's given us mixed results. Is this now time for a massive recalibration of how we approach global engagement on trade?
I think so, Siddharth, because if any nation can give evidence on why tariffs are not really good for a competitive manufacturing sector, it's India. For the longest time we had very high tariffs and didn't make much of it. Last 10 years, I think tariffs have been raised moderately, but I think they've been more a defensive measure than a strategic measure. In the absence of other reforms, tariffs are trying to give industry a cushion or make in India a cushion or, a stool to stand on with respect to global competition. But I think there's no substitute in the end for fundamental reform. If you want a globally competitive manufacturing sector, you need large tracts of land which are easily available. You need flexible labor laws. You need low costs of logistics. You need permissions granted in 30 days rather than 900 days. I mean, there are certain basics which, no matter how much tariff you put, will not solve your competitiveness issue. So I think this is a good time for us to take stock of our own internal policies and make ourselves more competitive. Ultimately, the more competitive you are, the better placed you are to face any kind of shock, whether it's a Trump tariff or any other shock that comes along. And this is still a very uncertain world. Now we'll wait to see whether there are retaliatory measures from other countries. We'll wait to see how countries negotiate. So it's going to be very uncertain for at least the next 12 months, probably longer. So I think this is the window. The government is still very early in its term. It's got a new lease of political life, with successive election victories. So it has political capital, and it must be used now to do those domestic reforms, basic domestic reforms, which make our manufacturing more competitive. I think there's no substitute for that. Tariffs are never going to make India globally competitive. So I don't mind if they come down as a result of this. I think we should put them down rather than up in response to these measures.
Dr. Dasgupta, what would you call for at this stage? Because clearly, as far as President Trump is concerned, he believes that he can upend 40 years of outsourcing in 4 years of his term. Be that as it may, what does it call for India to do at this stage?
The first thing which comes to mind is that we should keep talking. Negotiations will, of course, should take place, and whatever we can do with, without really hurting our core interests, that I think we should be in a position to concede, whether it is by way of tariffs or non-tariff barriers. A lot of quality control orders, for instance, have been issued in the past 2 years or so, and they are providing, perhaps indirect benefits to the large domestic players and exporters, but the smaller ones amongst our domestic manufacturers, exporters, they are hit very badly by the QCOs. And this needs to be taken a fresh look at, whether they are really serving any purpose other than harming our own interests. So it is a time when I think some introspection, some concessions which we may give, which will really speaking do us a lot of good. So that is the kind of thing that we need to do. Of course, I don't think that President Trump will make any exception for India. He did mention that the Prime Minister is a good friend of his, but he was not in a position to do anything particularly, particular for India. So that will continue. But I have a feeling that President Trump will also need to have a face-saving measure, a device which would allow him to roll back the tariffs, at least for some countries where he finds that the tariffs are actually hurting American consumers the most. For instance, textiles and clothing. The US hardly produces any clothing these days. Most of it comes from Bangladesh, Vietnam, China, India, and a few other countries. Now, that is one of the things which will feel the pinch. Already I think there are indications that the prices in Target, for instance, will have to go up. The Target share values have come down. There would be other indicators also. So this is just one of the things. The second aspect is the US is a net importer of agricultural products. I think in 2023 it imported about $204 billion worth, and it exported between $170 and $180 billion worth. So if it imposes tariffs on agricultural products, the poor are going to be hit very badly. And President Trump would need to, I think, make a mid-course correction. Incidentally, there is a budget lab in Yale University which, before the tariffs were announced, has done a rough calculation, and it has found that the upper income bracket will end up spending about $9,500 per family per annum extra, and the poor would be doing it for about $3,500 worth. The average would be about $4,200 worth of extra spending for a household in the US because of the tariffs. That was before the tariffs were announced, and the expectations were that they would not exceed 20% or so. But in effect, they have gone much higher. So I think all these factors taken together, there would be a kind of a rollback. So India should be in a position to take advantage of that. So negotiations should continue. Some concessions which do not really hurt India, but in a sense could take the process of reform forward, that we should not hesitate, shy away from taking those steps. So these are some of the things which we can do. Of course, and the point that Dheeraj has made very strongly about the reforms, I think that cannot wait any longer. If we are serious about Viksit Bharat, if we are serious about Atmanirbhar Bharat, Make in India, we need to have a very a set of deep structural reforms and wide-ranging reforms.
Well, that's absolutely correct. And if deregulation were to be the direction of what is already now stated intent of the government, much of our license Raj, inspector Raj, much of it, that compliance Raj actually that still prevails, will have to be dismantled. We'll have to see how that plays out. Rajni, I want to come to you on an important aspect, and that deals with our currency and exchange rate management. You've seen what's happened to the rupee in the recent past. The question that I pose to you is, do you see any impact on how currency management is approached in India and perhaps across the globe as a consequence of what has just been announced?
What we saw in the previous trade war, in the previous Trump regime, we saw that emerging economies, they took recourse to allowing their currency to weaken so that they could take care of the tariff impact. And in fact, in that period, we saw Chinese yuan weakening quite sharply. And in fact, Indian currency also weakened because yuan was weakening, and India wouldn't have liked to lose on export competitiveness. So I think we could see something like that happening again. I think China would let its currency weaken to kind of partially take care of the tariff impact. And in RBI would also be okay with the currency weakening so that our exports remain competitive. So that's what RBI would like, and more so, also what we are going to see is, anyways, we are expecting our current account deficit to widen. So this year we are expecting our current account deficit at around 0.7% of GDP, and next year it would be more than 1% of GDP, but it wouldn't be very high. That is because our services exports are still healthy, and that is likely to support our current account balance. But again, on capital inflows, there would be a lot of uncertainty. Already in FY25, we have seen that FDI as well as FII inflows were quite severely hit with all this uncertainty. And that's likely to continue in FY26 also. So I think all these factors will put pressure on rupee to weaken. However, I do not expect a very strong weakening of rupee. We have still factored in around like 4 to 5% of weakening of rupee in FY26. So end of the year, probably FY26, end of the fiscal year, rupee at around 88 to 89 is what we are looking at.
Dheeraj, I wonder, you want to also comment on the exchange rate component before I ask you a question about the China angle in this story?
No, I think, because we are an importing nation and have been so for years, we have an aversion to a weakening rupee. But I think, sometimes the rupee tends to be too strong for our export interests. So I don't mind depreciation in the rupee. Obviously, we don't want volatility and sharpness in decline, but I think we must maintain our competitiveness, and RBI can perhaps let market forces do their job while smoothing only volatility, not direction.
Okay, the China question, and this is something that I want to bring up here. The tariff hit, viewers, on China is greater than what was expected. In fact, if you look at the list of the countries, some of the starkest examples are in near India countries, where the hit, including on Bangladesh, for example, or Myanmar, is very, very significant. But there is the question is, what does this mean for China from the context of the recent signs that we have seen that things may be headed towards greater resolution between the two countries, and the border dispute and the Chinese aggression on that front may get tempered on account of the new trade dynamics? Is that an argument that you would agree with, and do you see that panning out in the near future?
Well, I mean, the formula by which they have applied these reciprocal tariffs is interesting in itself and quite novel. I mean, I don't think I've come across it in any economics text. And I think, in a way, China, Vietnam are faced with higher barriers because they are more competitive. Compared to India, they have greater exports to the US and a wider trade deficit. And therefore, by the calculation method, they have to face higher tariffs. But of course, I mean, it will be a challenge for China. But I think, if there is one country which Trump could have legitimately targeted, I'm only disappointed that it's so wide ranging and across the board, because China obviously follows certain non-transparent practices. It's not a complete market economy. They use a lot of subsidies and other instruments to support their industries and international markets. So I think to the extent that these tariffs had to be implemented, I'm not unhappy that China has got the higher end of it, because that's the one country which has in fact violated the spirit of the multilateral trading system. Obviously, Mr. Trump is also a negotiator, right? So he has pushed it up to a certain level so that there is negotiating room, and China will have to come to the negotiating table, I think, because their economy is still unlike ours, because we are still a heavily internal market consumption driven economy. Theirs is the opposite, and they haven't really pivoted to a domestic consumption story. So either they're going to have to make a stronger pivot towards domestic consumption, or they're going to have to deal with Mr. Trump and make the necessary concessions so that they protect their export markets. But the only thing, again, I think, and Mr. Dasgupta would be in a better position to comment on this, is what are the prospects of India and certain other countries facing dumping from China, as China loses its market in the US in particular. I mean, that's something we have to watch out for. But I think with China, it had to be at this level for them to come to the negotiating table and for them to deliver meaningful reform. So I think, in fact, I would think some other countries have got a raw deal, but with China, I think it was bound to happen.
Since you mentioned raw deals, I haven't had the time to go into the fine print, but I'll try and do that. Madagascar hit by 48%, and I wonder what could have led to that kind of scenario, or Taiwan, which clearly is more aligned to the United States than to China, and look at the numbers there. But Dr. Dasgupta, is there a possibility that China's pain could be in some ways India's gain?
In some areas, I do see that, we will get an opportunity. And clothing, for instance, textiles and clothing is one area. Because clothing, we were subjected to a tariff of 14% to 32% in any case. Now that is going to be 26% plus 10%, 36%. Whereas for China, if we take it at 54% plus 10%, so it would be 64%. So we would get an advantage. And even with respect to Vietnam, there would be a distinct advantage. Vietnam is the third largest garment exporter in the world. Bangladesh, of course, is just a shade higher at 27%. And Bangladesh, of course, the industry is facing headwinds because of the political problems. So I think this will be an opportunity for garments in the US. For the leather sector also, there would be an opportunity because China has a very strong presence there. So there are some niche areas, and especially labor-intensive areas, where I think we will gain, perhaps at the cost of China.
Okay. Rajani, I want to come to you. We saw COVID and its aftermath for economic growth, for asset prices, and we've, kind of taken some time to get out of it and into a new groove. Is this disruption likely to have even greater consequences for growth? And is the current financial year, we are still in the third day of the current financial year, a washout from an overall growth and market valuations perspective?
I don't see the impact as severe as what we saw during COVID. because we have to take into account that we are a domestically driven economy. So definitely, all that is happening on the external front will impact our growth. But as long as we are able to maintain our domestic story, growth story, our growth will not be very severely hit. But even when I talk about the domestic growth story, the concerning aspect is what's happening on the investment front. So there are concerns, there were already concerns around private investment. So, and now I fear that with this uncertainty, and this uncertainty we don't know is going to go on for how long. But with this uncertain scenario, probably I don't see a very strong pickup in private investment happening in the Indian economy. So again, that would be something which would be detrimental to growth. But nevertheless, I would say that at this point in time, our domestic story is in a decent shape, and we should be able to take this blow without a very severe impact on growth. And this I'm basing on the assumption that private consumption will pick up in going
Okay.
forward this year because of the tax benefits that we are going to get this year. Government investment should also pick up in the coming quarters. So all these aspects should be supportive of growth. But yes, overall we are concerned about the external impact, but I don't see the impact as severe as probably what we saw during COVID.
Dheeraj, the final question on the show to you very quickly, if you can. Uh, what do you think monetary policy should be doing, if at all, as a consequence? And the MPC meeting is just in a few days from now. And I also wanted to throw in, can significant GST rationalization add to what Rajni said to keep the domestic consumption engine growing at a good clip?
No, absolutely. I think the answer to the first is the MPC has room to cut rates. I think we don't have a situation of excess demand. Even inflation is moderated, but even when it was there, it was more on account of supply side factors. So I think interest rates can be cut, probably will be cut. And GST rationalization, of course, I mean, it's the logical next step after, cutting income tax, because, at the end of the day, GST is paid by, every consumer, whether they pay income tax or not. So I think the bigger benefit will come if we can move to a 2 or 3 rate structure with moderated duties, moderated GST across the board. It'll again give a big boost to consumption. So this is one time actually, when a shock like this comes, perhaps we're lucky we are not Vietnam and totally an export dependent economy, because Vietnam would have very little other options, but we do. We are not such an export dependent economy. We have consumption, which is 60% of our GDP. So let's boost it. Let's cut interest rates, which will help both investment and consumption, and let's rationalize GST, which will boost consumption along to give a back up to the income tax cuts that happened. So I think we are in reasonably good shape. I mean, I wouldn't worry too much if we just use this as an opportunity to improve our competitiveness. Then whatever happens over the next 12 or 24 months, we'll be in better shape.
Absolutely. And viewers, earlier we've had two reactions. One official, a press statement issued by the Department of Commerce, very balanced, and saying that essentially conversations between India and the United States will continue. There's no rancor, there is no anger in that press statement, unlike many other countries, and that's characterized our response, a very mature response, responsible response, and our willingness to engage. We are amongst the few large economies in the world which have been engaging with the United States on this question for several months now, and that process may yield to some results. The other bit really that is very clear at this stage from a market point of view and from an overall economic direction point of view is how India will recalibrate the policy choices that it makes in the aftermath of President Trump basically dismantling the World Trade Order that we have known for years. The WTO was dead in the water for several years now. I think now its remnants have been dismembered across the sea to be never found. Dr. Dasgupta, since you've been at the WTO, the final quick comment from you. I have grown up reporting. My first beat was the WTO in the late 90s. Is that era now completely over?
Well, I do think that the WTO is in deep distress, but it is largely on account of two reasons. One, the US is moving away from multilateralism. It has pulled out of the WHO, it has pulled out of the UNFCCC, and WTO, it has made it near dysfunctional, especially the dispute settlement system, by not allowing new members to join the appellate body, and the ones who retire, their places are not filled up. So that is the US angle. The other point is that the other members, 165 other members, have been trying to stitch together some agreements, but the US is neither, pushing them or offering any, guidance or support. So it is not, the movement is not there at all. So these two things, without the US, the WTO can't run. And till the US comes back to the table and starts contributing, starts taking an active interest, I think it will have to lie low. But the developing countries need the WTO much more than the developed countries, who have already taken a lot from the GATT system and from the WTO. Trips, services,
Right.
and earlier, the mutual reduction of tariffs across the Atlantic and amongst the developed countries like, Japan, Korea. So all those things are there. But in future, the developing countries which are still climbing the ladder, they would need the WTO much more if it were to get revived at some point of time in future.
Absolutely, and viewers, the consequences and the ripples of this decision will continue to play out, not for days, for weeks or months, but at least for a few years, very clearly. And a new global trade order is perhaps evolving even as we speak. Dr. Dasgupta, Dheeraj and Rajani, thank you very much for your time with us today, viewers. We'll end this episode of Easynomics here. I'll come back with more expert views and voices that try and make sense of President Trump's reciprocal tariffs that have rattled and shocked the entire world. I'll see you again. Until then, goodbye.